Sanctions have been imposed on 82 individuals and 29 companies. German payment provider Wirecard went bankrupt on Tuesday.
Russia has launched an unprecedented disinformation campaign against...
Billions of dollars have been found in various offshore accounts.
Welcome to Integrity Insights, the Berlin Risk Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. I'm here at the FIBE FinTech conference in Berlin, recording this in a curious little booth. Our guest, Carsten Giersch, has joined me in this makeshift studio to talk about all things geopolitics, risk management, and how global events can shake up the markets in very real ways. I will leave it up to him to introduce himself, but I can't wait to dive into topics like the current geopolitical climate, the impact on global finance, and the ways businesses can adapt in uncertain times. So, without further ado, here is Carsten.
Carsten, hello.
Hi, Philip.
I would like to actually, before we get into the introduction, I would just like to kind of paint a picture for our listeners who are not here physically. We are at the FIBE conference in Berlin. We are sitting in a some sort of a box that looks like like one of these booths where you will take a smoke at the airport. So it's a very fascinating environment. But over to you, Carsten. Can you please introduce yourself? Tell our listeners here who you are, what your background is.
Yes, thank you, Philip, for having me here. My name is Carsten Giersch. I'm a senior partner at Berlin Risk Advisors and managing partner at ALL AML. These are two companies specialized in the area of due diligence investigations. I will say a couple of words about the difference between the companies in a second. My background is academic background in political science. So I've been working for many years at a university, studying international relations, international conflicts and risk management, and then moved into consultancies 15 years ago. And I'm a co-founder of Berlin Risk Advisors and ALL AML. At Berlin Risk Advisors, we focus on integrity due diligence investigations, so more in-depth on future business projects and partners. So we do really thorough investigations of the background and of prospective counterparties, and try to identify legal and reputational risks attached to them. And at ALL AML, we have a different model. So we specialize on investment fund managing companies. So we are external money laundering officers, and we try to keep dirty money out of investment funds.
Thank you very much, Carsten. And if it's not clear already from Carsten's introduction, Carsten is the perfect person to talk about the topics of politics, geopolitics. This is why I invited Carsten on this podcast to talk about the current situation, global situation. Maybe we can start with a subject which, going around this conference, I can see that a lot of people, I've heard a lot of references to this. People have apps, people trade stocks from their phones. Everyone see this market crash, which is something that we have been seeing pretty much since Trump took office at the end of January. But I guess my question is, all these geopolitical crises, be it the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, that has been there before. So what changed? Like, why is that why does the financial market react so strongly now as opposed to even before Trump took office?
Yeah. I think geopolitics is both about hard facts on one hand and about psychology. And I think this is really what constitutes the change. President Trump has created multiple new geopolitical hard risks and simultaneously eroded the trust and confidence of partners and markets and the reliability and credibility of U.S. politics. I think this is the key difference here. There are essentially four elements which have a longer tradition in U.S. history, but came to a joint culmination under Trump. And it is important to take into consideration that geopolitical risks emanating from Trump's making America great again, that those risks have both a domestic and an international component. I think these components really work together and mutually reinforcing each other. So let me start with the domestic components, if I may. So there is the concept of imperial presidency, so what we are seeing here. So this reflects the view of a strong man or strong men actually being the defining actors in global politics. So he has a tendency to expand the executive powers and to limit all restrictions foreseen by the American Constitution in terms of checks and balances. So the concept that we have been gotten used to as restraining the powers of an American president. So he kind of tries to get rid of that. And this is causing a lot of insecurity. Yeah. And he's also threatening people, removing people who could attempt to resist him. And he's even trying to gain control over the judicial system, something we can read almost every day, even ignoring their verdicts. Then this concept of imperial presidency is combined with anti-liberal politics. So there's also something that we're seeing every day, either by Trump statements or by statements given by his closer entourage. So he seems to feel close to authoritarian leaders, including Russia's President Putin, and to right-wing populist parties in Europe. And this is the expression of a cultural revolution, really. This is my reading of a nationalist conservative movement. They're trying to disrupt state institutions, and this also creates a greater uncertainty about the future of American democracy. And then, in addition to those more, let's say, domestic developments, what we see is the revival of partial isolationism. So that is something that we've seen the past of American history before, but this is coming back, at least vis-a-vis Europe and the EU, putting in question the US commitment to NATO and to defending Europe against the Russian aggression, which might go beyond Ukraine. So there are real scenarios at the moment thinking that this might happen. And Trump is not really, giving any assurances to the EU, but instead offering Putin a deal with concessions which are unwanted by Ukraine, really, and leaving everybody guessing if there are still credible security guarantees and a functioning system of deterrence by NATO. So this is essentially the concept of great power politics as politics of influence spheres. So he's kind of telling Russia, well, you can have parts of Ukraine. That's a legitimate claim, yeah. While at the same time, he's claiming control over other territories. He himself is claiming control over Greenland, Canada, and Panama Canal, for instance, yeah. So all this has eroded a lot the Western institutions' joint values, adding now to the insecurity and lack of trust towards the Trump administration. And then finally, the fourth component, well, he has pursued extreme protectionism. So that is quite clear now.
And we are speaking about the tariffs.
Particularly the tariffs, of course, yeah. And so he has enacted unprecedented tariffs package. We all witnessed that last week. And so this has actually the potential of triggering a global trade war. And that led to a large extent destroyed the trust in trade that included arbitrary tariffs and targeted not only opponents, but also partner countries, yeah. So he not just targeted China, let's say, as a major rival, yeah, country, but also targeted partner countries like in the EU or Canada or Australia. So this was the culmination point of an American first policy, and this sent the markets tumbling, and there's a serious risk of escalation now. So it's both, he created hard geopolitical risk factors, yeah, and at the same time undermine the, any credibility or any security guarantees or any trust in the reasonableness of American foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. Let me maybe dig a little deeper into the tariff issue, which you mentioned just now. Is it something, because that's what I hear this all the time, when you listen to interviews, podcasts on the subject. I think there are basically two groups of people. One, experts their position is that there is actually a coherent economic policy behind this. And other people are saying that this is all like completely random, but almost like policies created on a whim. Where do you fall on this question? Like coherent economic policy or randomness?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would actually like to offer a third perspective on this, if I may. So I think this is what happened is, I think, something that underlines that since Trump has been taking office, everything should be viewed as being driven by status and power politics rather than racial interest-driven politics. Yeah. So it's neither just a TV show, yeah, or completely rational alternative economic program. But there's a lot of psychology behind that. And you can see, again, I mean, I try to look at these developments from a different angle. So most observers are puzzled by the extent to which Trump destroys all what we assume to be common sense in American politics. And many thought Trump is just, a deal maker and deal making guy. And in the end, he will negotiate and everything, what he announced will not be so extreme. But it might be to a certain extent, this might still be true. But if you look at the underlying narrative of all of this, and it really is important to consider this. I think he's been talking about all of this for years, even for decades. So some observers went back in time and, he has been ranting against the EU or other, countries 40 years ago. So that is not completely new. So there's a certain continuity. So that includes, his hostility towards the EU as just, being founded in order to exploit the US, for instance.
To screw the US.
Screw the US, yeah. Also mind the wording, yeah. He's been raging against other countries in terms of unfavorable trade relations before, in particular China, of course, yeah. And he has been a critic of a strong dollar before, yeah. So, which, according to his assessment, puts a U.S. manufacturing economy at a disadvantage. And domestically, he has also been ranting against immigrants and liberal politics for some time. So there's a certain element of coherence. And what I read from all this is that this is a narrative of suffered losses in the past, victimization by other countries, and at the same time claiming a better future by making America great again. So that is the term. So this is the narrative, and he's campaigned quite successfully on this narrative, in particularly appealing to the American worker, who he convinced to vote for him. Yeah. And he promised to rebuild, and he is promising to rebuild the manufacturing business in the US. Well, you can think this is kind of weird. Is it just a populist agenda? And I don't think so, as this is quite a strong commitment and includes a narrative of both cultural change and overall improving the American status. The differentiation between what I would call interest-based politics vis-a-vis status-based politics is important here, because it drives a different approach to the politics of negotiations versus conflict escalation. So I think he's really status-driven, and whilst there might be a mixed motivation, it is important to understand that status plays a great role in driving the risk-taking behavior. So, and this is where we're coming to the key point. So it's well known insight from psychological studies that in conflict and other decision-making situations, loss aversion frames status conflicts, and aversion against perceived losses weighs higher than the outlook of securing equal gains. What that means is that this psychological distortion drives extreme risk-taking. Yeah. And this is responsible for escalating status conflicts to war, where nobody is willing to back down, even if escalation is economically harmful to the country and people. And you think this is kind of sounds a little bit weird or absurd, but just remember what happened with the UK's decision to Brexit. Yeah. So this was a decision motivated also by perceived loss of sovereignty and independence from the EU. So they also used a similarly hostile rhetoric of exploitation and so on. We all remember that. And there was a claim to regain a former greater status and to reestablish a glorious past through bilateral trade agreements. Yeah. In fact, it was an extremely risky decision where many warned against likely negative consequences, economic consequences, and we know that there are certain regrets now in the UK. So we can see it's not just in decisions about war and peace, but also in decisions about economic policy where this psychologically element might be valid. Yeah.
So, Carsten, if I understand you correctly, this is quite complex topic. Just to make sure I understand, so you're basically saying, or the way this theory applies in this particular case is that there might be some coherent economic policy behind it, but it's not even as important in this particular case because the status-driven agenda kind of primes the economic planning. The status is like more important in this case than having like a bulletproof economic strategy.
Yeah, exactly. This is a huge gamble. Yeah. And if we look at the rhetoric, it's a rhetoric of resentment against opponents, taking a revenge, but also revisionism. Yeah, so basically reestablishing the glorious past of a time when allegedly the United States was better off with tariffs, which is something that obviously economists and historians dispute. Yeah. And I think so basically he's ready to accept by this concept of making America great again through tariffs. He's accepting high risks, regarding possible negative consequences for economic interests in the short term, just in order to reestablish the status, thinking this will benefit in the long term, which is questionable, of course, And so if we look at the actual foundation.
Yeah, that was my next question basically. Like, because I'm sure like most people actually are not familiar with the as you say, with the foundation, or like on what basis were actually those tariffs imposed. Like if you asked me several weeks ago if the president of the United States has this kind of power, I would probably think not. But apparently,
well, what he did, he pulled a clever trick. Something that he did not do in this first term. So basically, his legal basis for the tariff package is a national emergency, declaring a national emergency. And he imposed the tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act from 1977, which was initially meant to apply to war situations only. But if you look at the introduction, when he introduced the tariffs, he referred to using a similar rhetoric that he used against immigrants who he alleged of being out to rape, pillage, thief, and plunder. He said he used to complain about unfair trade deficits, saying the U.S. has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by other countries for decades. And so this is how he justified declaring a national emergency. And based on that, he invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the rationale is to strengthen the international economic position of the United States, and now this is important to protect the American workers.
This is like explicitly stated in the document.
It is explicitly stated, and this is something that is a little bit disregarded in most of the media. He's appealing to the American worker, which is strange given his background and also the entourage, that the billionaire people that he's circumvented by, and who probably also now is a little bit surprised about this approach. But if you listen to J.D. Vance and others, and to the people who he listens to and who implement his approach, so this is actually the reference, the American worker. So rebuilding factories, manufacturing business for the American worker, and by that getting self-sustainable and all of that, And so, well, this is the background to establishing those 10%, basic tariffs, plus the so-called reciprocal higher tariffs on the countries with which the U.S. has the largest trade deficits. If you listen to economists, they all say, well, this is rubbish, But never mind. He doesn't.
Clearly not the economist that he listens to.
No, but all the international experts, they say that the whole rationale behind this is rubbish. But it's not about rational arguments.
Right. It's about the status.
Yeah.
Okay. Understood. Interesting. And we started this conversation by talking about the stock market. Obviously, this was following the imposition of the tariffs. This was the first kind of the signal that most people, or like anyone who is kind of trying to make some money with their savings, everyone noticed the impact of the tariffs in the short term. But what can we expect? What would you say is what can one expect in terms of, like, let's say midterm, expectations as a result of this move?
Well, I mean, if we look at the impact now, the downfall of the global stock markets after the announcement marked the shock, obviously, and then there is this, the question: will China retaliate? With their own tariffs? And there's, as far as I can, I would expect there is little other choice for them. yeah, because they would also lose their face, though. So this also now develops into a mutual status conflict, yeah. So unless there is a breakthrough and somehow they kind of agree to avoid a full-out trade war between China and the US, this will might actually escalate, yeah. And if it escalates, then this will have a much stronger effect on the world economy. Obviously, already the dollar has weakened by the lack of trust into the reserve currency. So that is actually might even be an effect welcomed by the Trump administration. And we look at previous statements and also other plans, the Mar-a-Lago Accords, the ominous, so to speak, yeah, where this is a scheme, alleged scheme to kind of target weakening of the dollar in order to improve exporting business in the US. But actually what I already indicate, most economists expect a double self-harming effect on the US economy by high prices on the imported goods driven by both the tariffs and the weakened dollar. And as a consequence, this will drive inflation in the US. The interest rates would go up. Yeah, this is why Trump is trying to pressure the Fed to lower the interest rates. But obviously, if you have increased inflation, that is difficult to do. And if the interest rates go up, then this will in turn have an effect on corporate lending and reduce investments. And by that, the economic growth in the US will go down, quite likely. Yeah. So that is actually what the experts, the economists foresee. And well, there is a rationale behind this, traditional modeling that predicts US recession and also maybe expanding to a global recession. And this would be quite the contrary outcome of, the envisioned increased economic growth and growth in manufacturing and jobs growth. Yeah.
I mean, I guess my main question, listening to kind of like, following the news cycle and not just in the recent weeks or months, but pretty much since the re-election and already since the first Trump's term is basically, is this the end of globalization? This is, I'm not going to disclose my age here, but like I grew up in a world where this was like the basic modus operandi, and now I'm kind of fearing that this might no longer be the case. So I don't know what your take on that is, and since we are in Europe, I mean, we have mainly talk about the US, but now we are in Europe. So what do you think the Europe can do to mitigate the fallout?
Well, I mean, the European Union has various options, yeah, and one option would be retaliating by raising their own tariffs, and they might partly do that on the one hand, and also like covering American companies dominating the media service actor like Google, Amazon, Meta, and so forth, because the tariffs are only on goods. Yeah, so that is the irony of it. The United States has a surplus in services. Yeah, but there might be a retaliation by the EU on the service sector instead. But well, this, as I mentioned before, there's a serious risk of escalation then. Yeah, and maybe that is not suitable to solve the matter and to avoid a recession. Really, second option is to build more plants in the US. So this is what Trump would really like to see, yeah, so that more international companies come and build factories in the US, yeah.
So like Volkswagen moving to...
Yeah. Some of them doing that already to quite an extent. In particular, the German car manufacturers have their manufacturing plants in the US and other companies. But the problem here is that, again, there we are back to psychology. Yeah, Trump is not really giving any assurances or predictability on the matter into the future, which would then, hardly create an attractive, condition for, for foreign investments in manufacturing plants. And the third option for the EU is obvious. And this is the question to your answer, is that the end of globalization? I don't think so. I think the EU is a huge market. Yeah, 470 million inhabitants. Yeah. And they have the power to extend free trade instead of the United States. I think this is a huge opportunity. They should extend trade with other global regions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. be more attractive for investments and to improve its competitiveness. So there's a crisis, but there's also opportunity, as they say. And in fact, if we look at what happened since December already, so the EU has adopted the free trade agreement with Mercosur. So this might, after years of negotiation, might actually become reality.
Sorry, you said the US or the European Union?
The European Union.
The European Union.
Did I say
okay.
US? No,
I
sorry.
think so.
No, I'm sorry. The EU has adopted a free trade agreement with.
No, that's interesting because I remember that's already when I was doing my bachelor many years ago. I was looking into this, the European Union trying to establish like working relationship with Mercosur. So it's good that it finally happened after 15 years.
Yeah. So this will create a free trade area with 750 million inhabitants. So it's quite impressive. EU has also adopted a free trade agreement with Mexico. Yeah, still needs to be ratified, but there is a huge opportunity now. EU might also join the comprehensive and progressive agreements for Trans-Pacific Partnership, so which comprise of 12 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Singapore. So a lot of larger countries, and the EU is now aiming to conclude the free trade agreement with India. Yeah, so there's a lot going on in terms of expanding free trade. China is a little bit of a tricky issue, as we know, because this is ambiguous undertaking. We are also concerned in the EU that China should abandon its anti-competitive practices of using state-subsidized or state-owned companies to produce overcapacities, which are then exported to the EU. So this must end in order to really expand the trade with China. But obviously, this should not be excluded as well. Yeah.
And you mentioned also so is the one way is to reroute these trading channels to become less dependent on the US and work with, as you said, Mercosur or these other regional groupings or countries like India. But you also mentioned the word competitiveness. Obviously, this is also, we are at FIBE, but at this conference, this is the buzzword here. What do you think the European Union can do to improve its competitive edge?
Well, I think the EU is already doing a lot now and must continue on this path. So it's I think a mixture of good regulatory measures on the one hand in order to be resilient, vis-a-vis specific geopolitical risks, and at the same time to create attractive conditions for investors in times of uncertainty. I mean, this is what we're really looking at the moment. So there is, for instance, the new capital requirements regulation with Basel III standards, which enhances resilience and capacity of the banking sector, which is really important in view of sustainable finance. Then there are major threats posed by cyber attacks, which is addressed by the Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA. The DORA is in force since January 2025. So these are important regulatory measures. But more important, the EU has also put in place investment and growth initiatives already, like the Invest EU, which is a longer tradition, which is meant to help mobilizing private investments for the EU's top policy priorities, such as green and digital transition and innovation, and was recently increased in February this year to improve EU's competitiveness. So this has become a larger pot, so to speak, which can be used in order to promote innovation. And also in February, EU launched the Invest AI initiative to support investments in the development of artificial intelligence. And I think this is understood now in the EU. For many months, the perception was a little bit that everything's happening in China, in the US in terms of development. But no, I think there is a clear now momentum now to also develop this AI business in Europe. And then we have a new focus area, which is also important in the context of geopolitical risk, and the new focus is defense investments. I think this is really important. There's an initiative called Readiness 2030 now, which boosts defense spending by the EU members, including Germany, but also to promote collaborative defense procurement projects. There was always been a problem in the past that every country has its own procurement programs. This should also happen as a stronger EU initiative. And the European Investment Bank, the EIB, previously focused on green transition now has doubled its defense-related investments to 2 billion euros. So that is happening. This is an important, I think, element to being resilient on the one hand, promoting innovation on the other hand. And I think this is the essence, the least we can do in order to improve deterrence, also against potential future aggression from Russia, signaling that we are actually willing to take security in our own hands and not to completely rely on security guarantees by NATO. Yeah. And then there is finally one important element, and this has been, a topic also for many years, and hopefully we'll see something happening there as well. The EU initiatives meant to mobilize private capital should be complemented by finally realizing the capital market union, the creation of a single capital market for the EU, which would really benefit investors, companies, and consumers. And hopefully this crisis will help to create the momentum to realize that capital market.
So it can be used as an really impetus to kind of bring about these changes that have been in the pipeline for a long time, but now it's kind of people are realizing that it's really now or never.
Exactly. I think this is the good moment. Instead of just staring at the developments in the US and this, let's say, unpredictable President Trump with his own agenda, I think this is now the time to define EU interests in a more progressive manner.
Let me ask you maybe just one last question. We don't want to exceed too much our format, which is usually around 30 minutes, but I really wonder one thing about these. Basically, it's related to this last question. What can the European Union, what can Europeans, do to increase their competitive edge? And from my personal experience, I just noticed, like I spent some time in the US, I have a lot of American friends, and I feel like there's also a cultural difference. That the US are just like young people in the US, they seem to be much more likely to, start a business, to take risks, to, when they're 18, spend some time in their parents' garage and do some all sorts of things. And I feel like it's just not the culture in Europe. So, and the initiatives that you talked about, this is obviously all like kind of bottom down, but this cultural shift, this is more like bottom up. So I was wondering if you have some thoughts on this, how can also, I don't know if the European Union or the national states can kind of like help to kind of shift this culture, change the culture.
Well, that's a very good point, because I just mentioned that, the nationalist conservative movement in the US, which is like a cultural change. And now we have the opportunity to also implement a cultural change, but be more progressive, being more liberal, being open-minded. And I think this has the two elements to this. Yeah, we have this tendency within the European Union to over-regulate things. Yeah, so that is important to understand. So there are some areas where you need regulation in order to be resilient. Yeah, let's say, for instance, you have this EU anti-money laundering regulation out from 2024. This will enter into force in 2027, and currently we're looking at the details, the standards that are being developed, and this can go two ways. So either it's kind of very formal, very, very extensive or rules-based, or this will go risk-based. So basically focusing on the real risk and being balanced in order to be compliant on the one hand, but not to put too many barriers, for instance, to inhibiting, let's say, innovation. And this is, I think, part of that mindset that needs to change. Yeah, because I do believe that there is now the time to leverage entrepreneurial spirit, and there should not be too much inhibition by regulatory barriers. So that is one important point here. On a more basic, if you look at it a more basic way, I think the entrepreneurial spirit really starts at school. Yeah, so that needs to change. So education is there's a lot of opportunity there. When you look at how the topics are taught at school, that needs to change. Definitely, this should continue throughout the university, and it should encourage risk taking. Yeah, so there's no innovation without taking risks, and this is why I think there is now that is encouraged and also leveraged by funding in particular. Yeah, there's a good chance that Europe might establish itself as an alternative to now the backward-looking US and being the open-minded, liberal, progressive continent in the world. that is attractive for free traders and global innovators.
I like that very much. I think it's always good to end on a positive note and then like setting an agenda what you can do as opposed to just kind of complaining about what is happening elsewhere. So thank you very much for that, Carsten. And also thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know that you are very busy, so I'm really glad that you could come on the podcast. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. It was a great pleasure.